Okay, let's make a start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us wherever in the world you might be for our series of talks on diversity, dynamics, and crises in paleontology. Before we begin, I just want to highlight our code of conduct to ensure that this meeting runs or this event runs successfully and with everybody in mind. Please take a moment to have a read of this, and then we'll get on to introducing our wonderful speaker. Okay, I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Michael Rivera, who's a bioarchaeologist and biological anthropologist. Dr. Rivera is a Filipino-Chinese researcher, writer, podcaster, public speaker, and biological anthropologist, currently based at the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. He obtained his PhD from the University of Cambridge, where his main research focused on how humans have evolved and adapted biologically and culturally over the last 10,000 years in coastal environments. Dr. Rivera is also interested in heritage and museums, decolonial theory and praxis, the history of race and racism, and the decolonization of archaeology and anthropology. Today, we are delighted to have him speak on a talk entitled, "We All Deserve to Study the Human Past, the Current State of Bioarchaeology and Paleoanthropology." So if I stop screen sharing, Michael, you should be able to share yours. Fantastic. We're all set to go then.
Yep, let me just move around some windows and then, okay, I think I'm good now. Okay, so hi everyone, very happy to be speaking to you all today, really appreciate it. Today, the main topics I want to talk about are the colonial and neo-colonial frameworks and practices that persist in the study of the human past, issues with inequity and exploitation, and lack of access in biological anthropology overall, and where there is room for us researchers to improve. You can tweet at me during or after this talk. You can leave questions in the chat. I don't think I'm going to talk for the full time, so lots of time for questions. And I also I have a few slides to introduce myself, but then after that, I just wanted to talk to you and have a heart-to-heart about some of these topics, okay? So just to introduce myself, my name is Dr. Michael Rivera, and as Emma introduced me as, I am a Filipino-Chinese Hong Konger. I grew up here, and my pronouns are he, him, his. So I'm speaking to you today from my home in Hong Kong, where I was born. I grew up here until I was 18, and then I went to the UK to get most of my training and experience in teaching, in science communication, in public speaking, and also at the University of Cambridge in particular was where I got my master's and PhD in biological anthropology. And while at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, I certainly learned a lot about elitist colonial approaches to the study of human evolution. Oof, a lot. And at the moment, I currently work as as an educator and a researcher at the University of Hong Kong. I teach archaeology to a class of 120 students this semester. We're just about to finish. I teach them about bones, about ancient monuments, ancient societies, material artifacts from the past, and I'm really enjoying it. And I feel so lucky that I get to do this where I grew up. It's kind of like seeing kids that were like me, but instead of having to go to the UK to study what this topic is, they can now study it with me. And so it's been very rewarding. And this other picture is of me doing another job that I do, which is I'm the lead archaeologist on an excavation happening in Hong Kong, actually later this week. So on Friday, starting for 2 weeks, my team and I are going to go out to one of the mountains in Hong Kong, and we're going to excavate a military aircraft that crashed in 1945 during World War II. So it was trying to, in the defense for Hong Kong during World War II. And so I'm interested in a lot of different things, and I do a lot of different activities, and everything from ancient societies 10,000 years ago to those who perished in World War II. But the thing that links them all together is that I like to get at the human story. I'm a very, a deep empath, and I just like studying everything to do with people. So let's go into that a little bit further. Let me see. So, I think that my slides are a bit. Okay, sorry. So as a biological anthropologist, what I do is I investigate humans from a biological evolutionary perspective. And so some of us in my field, my friends and colleagues, they will study things like genetics. What influence does our parents passing on DNA to their children have on the ways that our body develops? What about our outward appearance? Does it actually have an influence on our behavior as well? And then we also look at a lot of the environmental influence. So living in different climates, temperatures, different circumstances, maybe economically, different access to food. What effect does that have on us biologically? And so I think at this point would be where my sort of intro slides end, and I'm going to go into my topic now. Before I do that, I would like to actually stop share for just a second. Let me just fix something because I just noticed like my own slides are a bit off. Sorry about this. Should just take a couple minutes. Okay, I think that this is okay. Let me try and share this once more. Okay. Okay. So on to some of the problems that we have in our areas of anthropology. And there's a history behind these problems. So let me explain
Michael,
them in
there's
terms.
the publisher view that we see the publisher view at the moment.
Oh, I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
Yep.
Let me share the other thing. Let's see. Maybe it's this one. Is that better?
It's just loading. That's perfect.
Yep.
So yeah, so let me explain some of these issues in terms of bioarchaeology and then anthropology. So two separate but related disciplines. Archaeology as a discipline began as an extension of history, historical studies. And a lot of people might think that it began in the West, but archaeology was studied by scholars who were Chinese, Mesopotamian, Muslim, Yoruba, South Asian, Mayan, Greek. Archaeology is the study of ancient artifacts, bones and buildings. This was already being studied. However, Western archaeology began in the 1700s and 1800s, and that included the earliest excavations and scientific investigations. Western archaeology has its foundations linked very closely with the Euro-imperialist project and nationalistic motivations of those days. Collecting artifacts and the human remains of peoples far away, and then holding them in universities and museums would demonstrate an empire's reach and the power that they had to do such looting, pillaging, and body collecting without consequence. The idea of decolonial approaches to archaeology became more popular after World War II due to the atrocities inflicted in the 1940s that were motivated by nationalism or fascism, and also like increasingly popular ideas about political independence by nations in different parts of the world. Now, many nations now do not have a European power in charge of them, but there is still a great deal of what I've observed of capitalist economic imperialism, and in academia and knowledge production, a lot of intellectual imperialism too. And so particularly in archaeology, indigenous peoples, Black folks, and other marginalized populations like the Asian and the gay communities that I belong to our histories tend to be objectified by Western elite intellectuals without much incorporation of, those very people's input, especially in scientific research design, like right from the initial stages of how you design a project to, which communities that you might work with, which students you choose to train, and how the whole procedure, the flow chart, the process of how science happens, and even how it's distributed and publicized afterwards. At every stage, there are these many different aspects of exclusion and extraction. And so this is the sort of thing that I'm going to dig into deeper. When it comes to biological anthropology, so again, that's a study of people from a biological evolutionary perspective, really looking at the person, not just their material artifacts like archaeology. My field began some time ago, properly organizing into a field when the first Neanderthal fossils were found around the 1890s to the 1930s-ish. And any ethically minded anthropologist in our discipline should be ashamed of our earliest forebears who focused a lot on typologies, especially racial typologies that were designed to classify human groups into racist, hierarchical schemes. And over the decades, it would have been good for our field to progress, like not just in our technology or our insights, but also the ethics of our practice as well, and also the care we take in how we do our science. Because I find, and many others find, that we have repeatedly failed in our field with some of our genetic studies on human health and health disparities. In forensic anthropology, there's a lot of work about biological profiling that is a bit iffy to some of us now. In paleoanthropology, so the study of our human ancestors, looking at the narrative of how human evolution occurred, particularly in Africa and Asia and parts of the global South, because the traditional story is that, we all come from Africa and then moved to Europe or towards civilization. And you would think that these things are not in textbooks anymore, but they are, or they're being said orally by the lecturers. Sometimes old guys, but sometimes also young people and young scholars, and that's not that great. And so basically, studies about archaeology and anthropology have continued to be done and framed in these problematic ways, though you would think we would progress in that 100 years later. Now, let me move to 2019, when I just graduated with my PhD from good old Cambridge. The Black Lives Matter movement that began in 2013 was infused with new energy and a sense of urgency since 2019, and has really called into question many academics and many scientists' purpose and responsibilities in greater society. And when it comes to racism, and in particular anti-Black racism, great swathes of the public colloquially believe in many myths surrounding race, especially the idea that race has any sort of biological or genetic basis, when in fact it doesn't. And we have needed to do more recently to educate the public about the history of race concepts and how Western race concepts derive from a system developed in European policies of oppression and discrimination, and then were exported from Europe to lawmakers in Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and even global South nations that were formerly colonized by the Europeans. And so we've needed to do more of that and educate the public about, about how that's not to say that prejudice against someone because of their perceived race isn't real, but this idea of genetic or biological race, that is not rooted in any science. But yeah, it really is an important thing to note that there is a social construct known as race and a social reality that many experience as racism, despite the fact that biologically there is no basis. And then when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, biological anthropologists also have insights to offer regarding what's going on in current times. Although certainly not everyone is thinking about certain issues. Many anthropologists are lacking an understanding of the context that communities of color and other marginalized people are living in. Some scientists are even publishing papers still with those assumptions about race. And so as a response, others of us are pushed to fight against racial essentialism, which is this idea that there's this intrinsic genetic essence that defines all members of a racial category, such as Black or Asian, making them inherently less or more susceptible to COVID-19. That sort of idea is false. Some of us try to do the proper work to consider also the environmental and the socioeconomic contributors to poor health surrounding patients. So things like food security, job security, access to healthcare, education. There's a lot of targeted advertising, the amount of green space in your neighborhood, whether that allows you to, do social distancing. There's a lot of structural racism, interpersonal racism, and of course, the prison system and mass incarceration that all contribute to who gets COVID more often or more severely. And because of COVID-19's challenges and the restrictions to keep this pandemic in check, educators and scientists are also not immune to the issues common in many other industries or many other lines of work. Our job market has fewer places to offer to our graduates, and especially in archaeology, our students cannot travel for fieldwork or conferencing, or even during the holidays, they can't travel for family time. And so I think that when it comes to scholarship published in the last 2 years, when any of our scholarship appears to ignore the social or political issues of today, it's no wonder that I would say that, fields like anthropology are not appealing to many people in the public, and especially the governments or especially funders who fund research. And so these problems on diversity, these problems also work further to contribute to a lack of diversity in the field. But yeah, these are very big issues. To my mind, it requires a lot of people to be on board with even trying to understand the issue as a whole. A lot of people don't really understand what's going on, and they don't think that it's their responsibility to try and understand what's going on. So it makes it quite tricky because there's so many things to think about. I've said for maybe 3 or 4 years now that I think that changing my discipline and dismantling those sort of oppressive structures really takes an entire discipline. Nobody can slack off. But frankly, not everyone is keen on participating. And that's what causes that's what maintains the system. Now, I love that the organizers of this series want to concentrate also on the solutions, the practical steps we can take in our own spheres to make a difference. And so what I'm going to describe are steps I've seen taken by others in my own discipline, and also actions that I've also tried to make a difference with in changing our approaches to, first of all, avoid retelling those stale, problematic narratives about human history. I think it's obvious that it starts with what we teach in our classrooms and in our lecture halls. So it really begins in the early training of bioanthropology. The traditional canon that's taught in many faculties tends to be out of date, not just in the scientific content, but in the connections drawn with other societal issues like environment or race and racism or social justice, and also the globalized world that we live in, where we now do actually have scientists coming up into the field from different perspectives, and we have contributions to the discourse and our scholarship. So just as a very easy example, I went to Cambridge. I was told that there is some guy who does, he's the expert professor of Asian archaeology. He understands the landscapes. He understands what people eat. And I'm just thinking, you may have gone there for 15 years, but never longer than a fieldwork period. I grew up here. And so I have 25 years experience knowing what people eat and knowing the environment. and also sort of how society runs. And if we're studying human societies, maybe I might not have all the theory, but I certainly have more of an understanding of the local context. Why would my society in Hong Kong, or why would my society in the Philippines or China or anywhere across East and Southeast Asia, what is our connection to our heritage? Or maybe human history? What questions are we interested in asking? We have ideas too. And we also have a lot of, questions and ideas about all of that. So yeah, while our textbooks, so the textbooks that are written for undergraduate students and also popular science books as well, they're mainly targeted for interested public audiences. But a lot of these books, just think about Richard Dawkins, or I probably shouldn't name others, but there are others that are writing these books, right, for students and young people and the public. They're predominantly authored by tends to be white people, tends to be people brought up in the West, tends to be men. There are a few volumes now that are written with a more decolonial stance, who want to incorporate that kind of idea of ideas about land back and decolonization, indigenization back into the narrative of human evolution. And then there are also a lot of books now written from the point of view of women, and of BIPOC writers and journalists and scientists. So, I myself put in a chapter on race and human variation in an open access textbook all about biological anthropology. And I was very happy because I could see the other co-authors of the other chapters. They were writing chapters about human evolution, and they included, Black men and women from South Africa, for example, instead of some old guy sitting in a desk sitting at a desk in Oxford. It's good that these things are being done. And I feel that because these volumes, as well as research papers, because they're critical of our field's work, this is making a huge difference in terms of students' understanding of our fields and what meaningful conclusions we should draw based on a reading of the evidence. After recognizing how our field cannot be separated from colonial ideologies that came before, without an understanding of the history of our field. And so I think that this is really important. I also think that more emphasis is now being placed on ways we can support and platform and empathize with the experiences of marginalized scholars that we work with in our research. So for example, to support folks, there are mutual aid funds that are developed for minority scholars. And this has made a huge difference to improving different people's chances of pursuing the careers they want. In our departments and faculties, a lot of academics have advocated recently for more affirmative action in student recruitment, in faculty hiring and job promotion. There's this idea that you could advocate for batch hires or collective promotions at the same time, so that even if you were to take in a scholar of color, they're not going to be alone, facing all that they have to face. And so it's thanks to these initiatives by people that there are more BIPOC and women of color in particular coming in, as well as anthropologists who are disabled and scholars who are trans, those who are queer, those from immigrant or first generation or lower income backgrounds. For all of those currently studying or working in bioanthropology, these folks also may need protections and research and resources, pastoral support. And so it's very important that we increase the provision of these things, and especially maybe through student groups, through unions, and through changes in university policy. In this Game of Thrones, academia also involves a lot about our profile and how much our scholarship gets recognized. And so this is where citation politics comes in as being key to the idea of how to promote not just a more diverse array of people, but Also incorporating a diverse range of thought, particularly those that challenge the traditional canon that tends to be overly Eurocentric, masculine, and patriarchal, heteronormative, elitist, and not community oriented. Sorry, I'm just coughing. Let me just get my breath. Okay, there are just a few examples of panels and papers with those perspectives that I think of are important to fill my head with at this moment. So I'm trying to read more from perspectives I wish I was reading when I was an undergrad. We have to be careful what we read, what we spend our time reading, and what we cite in our own papers and in our own blogs. The ideas that we discuss over coffee and retweet on social media, the people that we spotlight in seminar series and panel discussions and conference symposia. And if we're far along enough, what ideas and which people we decide to publish if we're working as editors and reviewers of journals. There's also something to be said about here in Asia about like translation work, given that a lot of our work seems to be published in English, more specifically a certain kind of pretentious academic archaeology English. So something that you can all think about also as ways to redistribute the work to different audiences using different Englishes or different languages besides English in articles or social media or in your blog posts. Payment for a translator can be something that you work out time or funding for. So for example, the World Archaeological Congress publishes a journal called Archaeologies. They translate many abstracts into French and Spanish to increase accessibility, or even Japanese or Korean. And the one on the and I also think there's another journal here in Southeast Asia that basically has abstracts written in like Burmese or Vietnamese or Filipino, and so that's really, really good. Something that I believe in strongly is that before all of this stuff that we do, anthropologists also have a lot of internal work to focus on. Like, we need to get rid of awards and prizes and institutions that are named after settlers and colonizers and unethical practitioners, whether in the past or they're still alive today. If they're still active today, that's even worse, because they're still continuing to do harm, and yet you honor them with an award. So we need to be very mindful of that. We need to develop further studies that also concentrate on the marginalization experience of people, so that we can use critical insights to help those who are facing those challenges. And so we really do need, as I said earlier, to consult with and make sure from the very get-go that Black scholars and Indigenous scientists and other minoritized groups have control over the design, the preparation, the execution, the reporting, and the public dissemination of all of our research. And to understand how important it is to focus not just on the ethics of representation, but we need to develop and nurture our empathy for everyone. As researchers, that means that we must engage with people, and we must examine who it is that we network with in our institutions and critically evaluate whether we are exposing ourselves to ideologies that all kind of fit the same picture, and not question whether they actually silence others or oppress others or inflict harm on others. The way that all of our fields work in the sciences is that it wants us to be divided into little narrow disciplines and subdisciplines. It intentionally is designed to create barriers between researchers, and entire fields are in competition with each other. So never forget that to go against that grain, you have to expose yourselves to words that they don't train us to read. And it might hurt sometimes, and to know that maybe you've done something wrong or contributed to something complicitly. But we have to hold the ideas and the struggles in our hearts and minds. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to act as resistance against those. And so for my final slide here, in my experience, besides the external and besides what you do kind of like thinking about others, you have to take care of yourself. And so self-care is so important when you're working to dismantle colonial or extractive science in the academy. For me, some things that have helped are realizing that, that this is daily work that will likely continue for a lifetime. Something that I've accepted a long time ago is that the last 700 years or more of colonialism and capitalist venture basically shapes everything, that shapes how everything works. And it is unlikely that before my lifetime, I will see the end of those issues in my field. And I'm very likely not going to solve all the problems by myself. But what matters to me is thinking about what skills or experience and network that I currently have that may help in the fight, and where exactly I can fit in the greater picture. And if I do something, if I do my part, then that is doing my part. But all things fought for that are good, like civil rights or environmental rights, is always a collective effort. And so it's important not to beat yourself down when things are not going so well, or you're struggling on it with it on your own. It's also important to continue to read, as I said earlier, read outside what you normally read. And there are others who I actually like, I read very broadly as well. So not just anthropologists doing this kind of thing, but I borrow even from TV and, you know, Marvel movies and anime and anyway, just a lot of different stuff. And I borrow their strength, or I allow their ideas to imbue inside my brain. It helps me believe that I can fight something that is seemingly impossible to solve. And I just take it like one step at a time. Always mediate what your needs are. It sounds simple, but what I mean by that is also setting time aside to think about your needs. So I basically have in my schedule, I look away from my phone and laptop on purpose, and maybe once a week, and I reflect on what I'm doing and whether I'm happy with what I'm doing. It's usually in these moments of pause that I've been, that I realize I'm feeling too stressed and I've been working too hard, or perhaps not working hard enough to dismantle and disrupt. And so kind of minding your energy levels is very important as well. In all of this, we need to treat ourselves well. We need to find ways to find hope and joy. That's very important in resistance. To be tired sometimes and require rest, and take time to recharge your batteries in order to assume fully our commitment to anti-colonial practice, community-oriented science, and greater equity in our fields. So with that, you know, it's I'm probably going to leave in like 24 minutes, but I'd love to answer some questions, and then I'm going to go take my rest for the rest of the evening here in Hong Kong. So that's it for my talk. You can find me on Twitter. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much for such an informative and very important talk, Michael. Particularly the last bit. I think a lot of people in the discussion or in the participant list, I'll notice, really needed to hear that. So thank you so much for that in particular. Just to remind everybody that you can pop some questions in the chat, and we have Michael for a few more minutes to talk. And also, if anybody on the panelists or the host list have any questions, please do jump in ahead of me. I was going to ask you myself, and I think you covered it at the end, but how to deal with setbacks, because I think a lot of this does involve going up against walls and really getting stuck against people who don't want to move. But I think you've kind of covered that. If you want to elaborate on it, please take the time to as questions start coming in.
Yeah, sure. Something I think is very, very important is that you never go into anything alone, is kind of what I briefly mentioned. But what I mean by that is, I remember one time there was this moment when my department was interviewing for a new faculty job, and once given to whoever it is, it would be, you know, a tenured position, and they would be a lecturer there for as long as they want. And I thought it was very important to get a good hire. It's not necessarily like, you know, just make sure that you're hiring someone who, you know, even though he's a man, or even though they may be white, or even though they may be Oxbridge educated, that's okay. But what are their ethics, and do they intend to work closely with communities? You know, a lot of people who don't really understand what I advocate for, on Twitter, they have called me like that I basically hate white people, or I don't work with white people, or it's really whack because both my employers now on the excavation and on the in the university are white guys, and my supervisor for my PhD was one, and my partner is white too. And I work with them because they're not afraid to talk about colonialism or racism in our field and the history of like the history that we need to be mindful of. And so you always have to kind of find your backup. And before you go meeting the head of department to tell him you need to do better, you need to. I would never have done that if I didn't already have half the department on my side, so to say. I had spoken to half the faculty so that they would kind of, after I spoke to the head of department, they would chip in different other conversations. I wouldn't have done that if I didn't have my supervisor supporting me. I wouldn't have approached my supervisor if I didn't have the other PhD students kind of like saying the same thing or wanting to do something about it collectively. I'm very grateful for them, like that they were open to those ideas. Even though it was quite hard at different times, and in the end it doesn't change much, but that's the sort of way I would think about that. The setbacks don't have to be your own to like feel all that burden on your own shoulders.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. I think this is a really good time actually for me to mention my partner in crime, Naseba, for organizing this with me, and definitely partner up with somebody who believes in the same goals and actions as you do. I've got 3 questions for you, and more probably might come in the time that I get these questions started. So I'm going to go straight for what's in the Q&A first from Nicholas. What are your experiences on the reaction of funding agencies on emphasizing anti-colonialism in grant applications?
Oh, so there are some main funders who are sort of the main ones that you apply for in biological anthropology, and they tend to be led by a certain type of person, and they tend to be more senior as well to even be the administrators of those funds. Those are the biggest funds, like as in they're the richest foundations or trusts. And I find them to be at least from what I see, very surface level performative, like they try to look like they are funding more scholars of color, for example, or maybe giving more money to women in a particular year in the last few years. And then they make a big deal of it, like on all their social media. And but there are just a lot of things that are not perfect about that process, because they still have funded for maybe 47 years, like the typical person that they fund. And so it's a lot to make up for. And to my mind, it's not really like enough. I don't have much interest in trying to bend my applications for funds to those who are not receptive to like those ideas. And it's such a tricky thing because you want to do science, you want to do research, it costs money, and sometimes it's the bad people who have the money. I try to in the last 2 years try to find people who I could ask for things and not have to compromise my principles or my vision of how things should go. But I say that but I only did it in the last 2 years because I finished my PhD. And if you had asked me to do this talk maybe 3 years ago, it would be so much tamer, and it would be so much more filtered, and I was still trying to kiss butt and stay and not ruffle any feathers, because I was afraid someone was going to take my doctor, my opportunity to get doctor away from me. The doctor stays forever. And so that was just my own my own tolerance level. Like I can tolerate it up to the end of my PhD. And then for my own mental well-being, I cannot continue to accept this. So the next time I talk to someone about doing work, I'm going to tell them in the first meeting, look, I finished my PhD. I can excavate, I can dig stuff up, I can analyze skeletons, and I can talk to people about science. But don't you for one second think that I'm not going to briefly mention colonialism, or I'm not going to challenge you if I disagree with you. Are you okay with me disagreeing with you? What's the best way that we can disagree and work together? And it's been okay. Now, all of you might have different things that you're struggling with in your own context, and so you need to decide for yourself what your limit is, and how much and at what times are you going to fight, and in what way you're going to fight, because you have to think about the longer future. Because if your mental well-being goes down, or this type of thing is causing you too much resistance in the academy, maybe you won't be in the academy for much longer, because they will push you out. And so being in Hong Kong, like also it rooted me, and, you know, fortified my, like, what I'm doing, because I'm here now and I must do it my way, because I'm very proud of being a Hong Konger. Yeah, all of you need to decide what your personal limits are, and don't let academia decide for you what you should tolerate, like the level that you should tolerate.
Thank you so much for that. I feel like I'm saying that so often, but this is very profound and very, very important. A question from Ailish regarding publishing. How do you think this can be done in a more inclusive and equitable way for local communities and researchers?
Related to the funders also, but also in publishing, I think that it is quite important to have more diverse people joining these boards or joining these committees, because. But I do see that there are more journals these days. So since we live in a more the informational age or digital age right now, there really are like a lot more journals that are popping up that are open access, or they do want to do translated articles, or they are saying that all of their articles, we have a quota that, like, half must be written by women. These type of journals are really good, and I would basically just try to migrate my research towards them. It is very in my field, it was very, very tempting to think that, oh, we must publish in these three main journals. These are the top three, or if you can get into Nature, even better. But there's way more than four. There's like 40,000 journals out there, and for sure there is an editorial board, or at least someone on the boards that could share your vision of what you would like to write about and how you want to do your science. And so and you won't get reviewer number 2 being horrible because they see what you're trying to do. It's okay. It really, really is okay to avoid those big name ones that everybody publishes in. I think that there's plenty opportunity to pursue in publishing or getting money from people outside those. You just have to kind of search further. The way that it's designed, I think, is that they kind of don't want you to see outside your department or see outside your lab group. But there's a whole world out there of people who do science in a different way, in many, many different ways. You just have to expose yourself to it and allow yourself to be open to it and receive the lessons or receive the support from somewhere else.
Fantastic. I'm getting questions over my messaging and also my emails and from other people. So you're very popular right now. Got
Oh, cool.
3
Thanks.
questions, and then I'm going to stop it there because the last question I want to ask actually really ties us well together. But first, from Mariana, I was wondering if you could ask Dr. Rivera, what do you think of current discredit of science, for example, with concerning flat earthers and other more subtle critics?
Oh, well, in our field in particular, there are some, pseudoscientists that really want to I don't know why, but they want to keep pushing like certain things like that aliens built the pyramids, or Atlantis exists, or that humans didn't travel from um, Asia-ish through the Bering Strait into the Americas, or into Alaska-ish region, and they instead went from Europe into the Americas. All of these kind of things in our field we are very troubled by, because they're rooted in a lot of racist ideas. So it basically is saying that if you're looking to where like the human story, it's Europeans who populated that whole continent, and so it's like a very weird kind of like power thing. And also, if you discredit who built the pyramids by saying that they're ancient aliens who did that, then you're discrediting the indigenous peoples or the historical peoples who lived in Egypt or Mexico or Belize, or Peru, where you just basically don't believe that global South or indigenous peoples are capable of much architecture. And so there are those things. I even one time in Cambridge received a whole book just randomly in my mailbox, and it was like a book about how everything we know about human evolution is wrong. And I read it, and it was a lot of racist nonsense. And so I think that, like, I'm not expert on it, but I think that some of my friends and colleagues do spend a lot of their research on tackling pseudoscience. It definitely is something that I would imagine in paleontology is also a field that is very important. And my thought is just that it should be encouraged. That should be funded more. That should be valued as something that is a good, something for social and public good. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. One other question. You've mentioned previously in your talk, you mentioned that not everybody is participating in these kinds of discussions, and sometimes we're discussing these topics in a bubble. How can we burst that bubble and include the people who are not willing necessarily to join these discussions?
I think that when I was in Cambridge, I really was so focused on getting, like, I really wanted to be a Cambridge professor, and it's so alluring, this idea that you can that you have this one path that you can go on, and then after that your life will be great, and it's very nourishing and it's very happy. But I guess I just faced too many problems, or witnessed others and heard that others are handling cases of like abuse or harassment, or their ideas are not being supported, and their research isn't being supported. I just became very jaded, and ask me the question one more time.
How can we burst this bubble and include these
Oh,
other
yeah.
participation? Or
Yeah, and what I wish that I actually did was not get allured by it. And so I think that it's very healthy for us to re-examine whether we are actually in bubbles every now and again. Take a look at like your labs or departments, who you're speaking to very regularly, and just think about whether you are living in a very homogeneous universe. Because at the same time, there were people in Cambridge who were arguing for divestment from fossil fuel industry, and advocating for Black rights, or that let's say, like, healthier, more beneficial pension schemes. But when I was in Cambridge, I didn't notice it, because, to be honest, I was still being trained, and I was still like junior as a scholar. And I wish that some faculty would have told me. So the more you know, and then after encourage conversations about it. But there's this real disconnect, because of course I would see things in the news in greater society, but I never thought that it was relevant to me. Why would it be relevant? In Cambridge, we never faced those things, but it was just my privilege and ignorance that, you know, it made me feel so comfortable with not feeling like I was doing anything complicitly. So I've completely changed the way that I think about that, and generally just try to question myself quite often. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
And I would say that it can also snowball. So once you expose yourself to a more to maybe like one march, or maybe one petition, like maybe you help put together a petition in your department. Once it starts there, try to have conversations with those type of people, like whoever is co-organizing or kind of looks very keen. Talk to them more if you don't know them already. Find those faculty, or find those students, or find those researchers who are around you, and maybe even your lab technician, essential workers like janitors and admin staff and IT guys. Like you need to talk to everybody who thinks that way. Then you're more likely to do work and collaborate with people in the long term, with people who share the same vision. Yeah. Stay away from those who you don't share the vision with.
Nice, good advice. Wrapping it all up with the questions Naseba has asked, and I absolutely agree with this. We see a lot of parallels between anthropology, archaeology, and paleontology. And I feel that we feel it's easier to talk about the human dimensions of archaeology and anthropology than we do in paleontology. And how can we start having such discussions when people are reluctant to see that these issues exist, and the way the paleontologists do research, because we don't quite have that human connection necessarily?
Right. Well, when I was a kid, I loved dinosaurs, like a lot. And I would watch Jurassic Park many times, and I would have all these books about like learning all the time periods, like the Cambrian, and I would learn all the names. And it's still people who put together those books and those films and those research papers. And so at least from where I stand in Hong Kong, growing up here, I can see how almost any science, as long as it's an achievement or something cool or interesting, can always be used for the agenda, like, different social or political agendas. And I think that although it's not as obvious, I think then my advice would be to try and pay more attention to that human element then. And a lot of people now do more meta studies. I'm trying to do some of that too. Meta studies about like who gets cited and who gets invited to panels. Just literally the data on that kind of thing can show a lot. Who gets published, especially, and cited. Another piece of advice that I have is like try to invite people who you don't normally hear from to speak in these series. And even if they can't speak in your series for 1 hour, just I've tried to arrange workshops where someone from a marginalized background will give their version of a human evolution related talk. And then we might do an activity together, like we might look at some fossils together and manipulate them in 3D or something as an exercise. But it's just by having different perspectives in there in the conversation, it might help to bring about like new challenges to like people's thinking. Yeah, I think that's what I would say. Try and pay more attention to the human element.
Yeah.
That does exist. It's just maybe not, it's been ignored maybe for too long.
Great. What an absolutely motivational note to end on. Thank you so much for such a fantastic talk and for joining us today for all the way from Hong Kong. It's probably quite late for you as well.
No, it's like 8 p.m. It's fine.
Oh,
I'm gonna go grab dinner now.
excellent. So thank you to everybody in our audience for joining us as well from all over the world. And hopefully you'll be able to join us on Friday at 4 o'clock UTC or GMT, when we'll be hearing from Martin Nunez at the University of Texas, who'll be talking about perspectives from ecology and how we make our research more global. So thank you again to Michael and to everybody for joining.
Thank you everyone for listening.